Hey everybody, I'm back after a pretty long time, so sorry about that, but it's time for some more Berserk Saga. And in this one, we're finally going to be getting started on Chapter 8. Now, I feel like I've been kind of complaining a lot about my experience with this game recently, and I do want to get across that that's not at all representative of the time I'm actually having playing the game. So before I get into the weeds of this map, let's have a talk about the story so far. We're at the point in the story where a lot of things are coming together and turning into some real dire situations for our heroes. And when we advance the chapter, there's actually going to be a large number of cutscenes all in a row covering this. So the war that's going on, unlike most Fire Emblem wars, are not centered around a single tiny group of revolutionaries fighting off the entire evil empire by themselves. Rhys's father is holding another front of the war all the way in the west of the continent, in Rhys's homeland of Sinon, while Rhys has been sent to serve the king of the Berserk League instead. And it's very apparent at the court that the people in charge are not necessarily the most competent, and also that not all of the king's advisors are on the same page at all times, which I think is a much more realistic proposition than your average Fire Emblem story. And that tension between factions is matched in the enemy as well, the Ray's Empire, because it's very clear from some of the cutscenes that we just had actually, that there are also factions within that are seen as lesser and separate, so there's a lot of internal conflict in the Empire too. All of this adds up to a narrative that's pretty complex and interesting. I don't know how much of that is in the excellent fan localization and how much was in the original story, but whichever it is, it's pretty great. While I'm gushing, I also want to talk a bit about some of the mechanics. Actually, I'm just going to focus on one. I've spoken a bit about Deathmatch already, and how it feels pretty nice to be able to control it, and how it's a very powerful tool. But I also want to talk about it in the greater context of the games that Shozo Kaga has worked on. Because he had been experimenting with skills that granted multiple rounds of combat for quite a while, ever since FE4. But in that game, a cost kind of sucks because it's completely based on random chance, and it can activate when you might not want it to. But you can see that his team iterated on it, on each chance that they got, starting with Thracia, when they made it always activate, but only grant one extra combat round. And then in Tearing Saga 1, it was replaced with Flurry, which is a command skill, which kind of addressed the downside of Thracia Accost, in that it would activate during the enemy phase when you didn't want it to. And Deathmatch is kind of the ultimate culmination of that. It's a command skill, so you can activate it when you want it to. There's no way to get it to activate when the enemy attacks you though, so it becomes a strategic option. And because it's guaranteed to be 5 rounds of combat, you can kind of rely on it, but also it's restricted in that you cannot initiate with it against an enemy who can't counterattack. And in that way, it has an aspect of risk and reward that I really like. So yeah, that's Deathmatch and why I love it so much as an evolution of the Accost skill. Anyway, while I've been talking about all of that stuff, we've been doing a large number of preparations, so I'm going to briefly summarize the important parts of that now that I've finished gushing. We moved the Eagle Brace from Faye onto Enid, because Faye is really close to level 10 and she's not going to need all that much extra combat, whereas we are going to be deploying Enid and pouring as much experience into her as possible on this upcoming map. I also bought a repair stone to repair her lady sword because it has been starting to wear out. As far as mercenary hires go, I picked up Axel, and he's usually brought because I need to cross some water, but this time around there's no water on the map, and what I need him for is his search skill. There are a lot of search locations on this upcoming map, and so I decided that both Zine and Axel should be deployed. We also go into the pavilion, as we usually do at the start of each chapter, but this time I'm cramming food not just into the units who need it for their happiness requirements, but also units like Reese and Ward, because the maps are starting to get a bit more difficult, and food is cheap enough that I think it's worth it to buy for pretty much all of my combat units, as well as Reese, even though he's not a particularly good combat unit on his own. I also replenished a couple of units' inventories because a lot of my equipment is starting to get worn out, and I had a talk to a chap named Almuth in the library at the Varia Temple, and he gave me a Kris, which is a type of dagger, and I then handed that on to Zine. Beyond that, there's a lot of my usual inventory management, which includes cramming all of my materials into the bags in the storage room. I'm still going to be doing that despite what people have told me, because I just feel like it, okay? So with that out of the way, the 6.5 minutes of preparations are finally complete, and we can just about move on to the actual gameplay of this map. So let's talk about the actual map. This is another Green Unit escape map, and the 4 ballisticians in the middle of the map are the key Green Units to worry about here. However, they don't want to head for the escape point until all of the civilian Green Units have escaped or are close to it. And so we're going to have a lot of turns to do some other side objectives. Chief among those side objectives is training up Enid a little bit, because she is still short of where she needs to be in order to permanently recruit Derek. There are quite a lot of searchable locations on this map, and so I decided to deploy both of my search units, Axel and Zine. During my initial test runs of this map, I actually tried to get away with only deploying Zine, and that worked out better than it had any right to, but once I started actually doing attempts, it emerged that that was just far too unreliable. And the reason for that is that several of these searches involve combat, which Axel is far more suited to than Zine is. In particular, there is this mini-boss, Vasquez, who Axel is currently fighting, and he has a huge amount of HP and is very strong. In my first 2 attempts at this map, I sent Zine in against him, and she managed to defeat him thanks to some lucky critical hits with the Karn Wenhao, which I think would have been extremely amusing to show to you all, but try as I might, she just would not repeat that once I started actually recording. And Axel is, as you can see, a lot more reliable, defeating Vasquez in a mere 2 hits. The searchers are going to remain clustered around the central area, but the distribution of my other units is a bit more complex. To the east is a team of units who are mostly just there to support Ruby. Sherpa is extremely helpful in this, but he also has another role over here. Later on in the map, there is an event that we have to do with him on the eastern end of the map, and that's connected to his permanent recruitment. Clifford is also making his way over to the east in order to support Ruby, but for now it's just the 2 of them over there, and they are going to be receiving some support from the Green Ballisticians, who, until the civilians are all off the map, as I mentioned earlier, will shoot down any of the enemies who are within their range. This is a bit of a double-edged sword for me, because they frequently take kills that Ruby would have been able to pick up if the enemy had survived long enough, but overall I feel they are a net positive, because Ruby is spread a little bit thin over there. Meanwhile, on the western side of the map, Volo, Dean and Silvers are all there supporting Enid, although obviously Dean and Silvers also want to pick up some experience during the course of this map. And in a moment Dean is going to make a start on that, because he is in position to be attacked, and he activates Vengeful, which means that he easily one-shots an enemy that I was hoping he might weaken, despite the fact that that enemy activated his shield. But that's obviously fine, because there are plenty more units for Enid to get experience of later on. Now, before things get too complicated, I want to talk about one of the civilian requests on this map. In order to complete this, I would have had to have Daoud move up to the north of the map, where there is a strange tree that stands out, and he would have collected wood from that. However, I could not find a way to fit him into my deployment for this map, and also because of the rush that comes later on, I felt it would be tricky to get him up there and then back down with all the other things going on. So that civilian request got left by the wayside there, and I'm hoping that it doesn't come back to bite me later. Back over on the eastern side, Ruby continues to prove me wrong about her uselessness, because despite the fact that she misses, she manages to dodge and kill an enemy to gain a little bit more experience, as well as some equipment experience, which is pretty great. And then another pretty funny RNG thing happens, as one of the green ballisticians actually ends up activating the MAIM skill, which I think is just really funny, that they can apparently aim with enough precision to potentially increase their cripple chance from halfway across the map. Sadly, that cripple didn't go off, but it would have been really amusing to me if it had. Scene takes a break from collecting search locations to enter this shop, and the reason I do this is that there is another secret civilian request going on there. She picks up something to be delivered to the shops back in the city. I don't even remember whether I bothered to check what's actually sold at this shop, but I'm sure it's not that important. Ruby has managed to get a little bit beaten up, so Owen is going to heal her up here. She takes quite a beating over the course of this chapter, but you'll notice that she and my other mounted units are generally dismounted for most of this map, to prevent their horses from taking all of that damage. Ward is visiting a church building in order to complete one of the civilian requests. He has to sit on this tile for several turns in a row, so he's going to be pretty useless until he can finally walk away once that spawns in another green unit. Meanwhile, Reese's civilian request involves him talking to several of the green unit civilians. First, he needs to talk to Martha, who is distressed because her daughter has vanished. This talk conversation causes the daughter to appear on the map in the far southwest, and Reese now needs to go down there and talk to her as well in order to complete this civilian request. Because of this, he is of course mounting up in order to make that take fewer turns, because he also needs to return to the fray later on. So something I quite like about the defense maps in this game is that they seem to build up. Like at the start of them, there aren't all that many enemies around, but then they appear as reinforcements from unpredictable directions, and I think that really helps to communicate the feeling of having to react to uncertain situations as enemies come at you from all directions. So kudos to the designers for that one, I really like it. Though speaking of reinforcements, they do come often and in large numbers, so Sylvis is going to be using her Overwatch skill quite a lot in order to mitigate the effects of that. This allows her to wall off certain enemies from reaching Enid, who may have needed to move in a bit close in order to claim a kill, and this really demonstrates the value of the Overwatch skill, I think. Axel is going up against another thief, and something curious actually happens at the end of this. The reward for visiting this house is a thief's knife, but Axel is actually going to pick up 2 thieves' knives, and that's because in his final attack, he manages to get the generic axe effect of knocking the enemy's weapon out of his hands. And so because that enemy has a Thief's Knife, Axel ends up getting that as well, which is pretty neat. Now, you may have noticed that one of the ballisticians has a face and a name. This is Burrows, and we can recruit him by ensuring that he and all of his companions survive the map. In order to clear the map, only 3 of the 4 ballisticians actually need to escape. So in a true LTC, we would probably let only 3 of them escape and leave Burrows to his fate. But since this is full recruitment, I have to make sure that all 4 of them get away. Reese has talked to Meryl, who is now heading for the escape point, and he is now going to turn around and go back to support Enid with his commander skill. Speaking of Enid, I think it is worth reiterating what she needs to achieve. In order to recruit Derek permanently, Enid needs to promote, and in order for that to happen, she needs to reach 5 magic. Now, there is a growth bracketing system in this game, which means that you can only get a certain amount above or below your average stats at any point. So Enid's averages are important in determining how much training she needs to reach 5 magic. She has a base of 2 magic and a growth of 20%, which means that every 5 levels her average increases by 1. So at level 6, her average magic is 3. She has tight bracketing of plus or minus 1 on her magic, so her maximum possible magic at level 6 is 4, which means that with the liquid magic stat booster, she could reach 5 at level 6 if I am able to get that. Without the liquid magic, she needs to reach level 11 in order to be able to have 5 magic at all, because that's when her average increases to 4. Now, one of the ingredients required to get the liquid magic from the alchemists is a soma, and I have not found a single one of those so far, so I'm starting to get a bit worried that I won't be able to get the stat booster at all, which means that Enid is going to have to be ground up to level 11. Plus I have to rig magic on that 11th level in order to hit 5. I don't really want to have to level her beyond 11, because once she hits level 11 she will lose Paragon, and so she'll get less experience from kills. Anyway, Axel and Sazine have pretty much finished up visiting all of the search spots, so they are now heading for the south, though they are not going to escape yet, because I want to make sure that their actions are available for enemy movement order manipulation. But speaking of my training projects, Ruby has finally managed to hit level 10, and that means that we will be able to permanently recruit her very soon, which is excellent. She still has some way to go to her promotion, which is required to recruit Clifford, but this is definitely an important step towards that. Something I have noticed about this game is that I am often tempted to mostly bring physical melee units, and because of that, ranged enemies are really annoying, which explains my decision to have Sherpa simply delete this ranged enemy rather than let him continue to run amok. The Brim Ranger is running quite low on durability, and I'm probably going to have to spend a repair stone on it at some point, but for now I'm trying to use it only on priority targets. I gambled here having Volo attack an enemy that he could potentially kill, and it turned out okay because the enemy managed to shield Volo's attack, and that allows me to finish him off with Enid rather than Volo getting the experience, so that was pretty good. Now, we're coming up on turn 5, but the ballisticians have still not yet started to move towards the escape point, which explains why this is such a long map. I was not able to find a way to make them start moving any sooner. Some of these enemies seem to have an interesting AI as well, which makes them go directly for the ballisticians, completely ignoring the fact that Ruby and co are there well within their range. I'm not sure whether they are angling for the ballisticians or for the civilians, but either way, it's an effective way to make sure that I have to be a bit proactive in keeping those guys safe. As it happens, it's very effective because that guy does manage to get through and get in an attack on Burrows, which means that I end up turning around my entire eastern group in order to protect him. But it's okay, because I have Owen free to physic the damage off, and we're also going to easily be able to get him to not attack Burrows, which I'll get to in a moment. For now, Axel is heading into the last search house, and unfortunately on this reset I forgot to change his equipped weapon away from his almost broken iron axe. So that obviously breaks, but fortunately you don't actually have to defeat the enemy in order to get the item, as I've been let know by commenters. So this is completely fine. We still end up getting the money, and Axel gets rid of a thing that I could be distracted by later on in a much more dangerous situation. So I think that's all good. The ballisticians have finally started to leave on this turn, but it's not all of them at once. Instead, one ballistician starts to leave on each of turns 5 through 8. They're programmed to also not take any shortcuts, but wind all the way along the road that curves all the way out to the southwest before heading down to the escape point. And so they're going to take quite a long time with their terrible 2 movement. They also don't bother to attack while they are retreating, so they are now pretty much entirely dead weight. Speaking of dead weight, most of the civilians have managed to make it off the map by now, and Zine is also heading south with her job done. She's really not capable of making any further combat contributions. Axel is, of course, so he's going to be hanging around a bit longer, but Zine just needs to wait and be there for me to stall turns. Ruby goes for a killing edge critical against the guy who had a go at Burrows. She fails to get it, but fortunately this guy also has that weird Fury AI that I was confused about a few maps ago. And so he ends up attacking Ruby himself instead of going for Burrows, who is completely defenseless. And this leads to his immediate death. Sherpa, meanwhile, is once again pulling out the Brim Ranger to deal with an enemy that I don't want to have to deal with, and this time that's an enemy mage. Most of my combat units don't have very good magic, so mages are pretty scary, and I just want to wipe them off the face of the map as soon as they show up. Now, Burrows has been showing off one of his skills, specifically Battle Cry, that makes him stronger and more accurate. I'm not sure how useful this is going to be, because he only has 2 move, and so he's likely to want to be moving rather than battle crying when on my side, but it's interesting to know that he has it. He also has the Hurry skill, which would boost him up to 3 whole movement. Wow, so amazing. But the annoying thing about this is that if he had used Hurry exactly once in the course of this map, that would have saved me a whole turn. But he doesn't, so I guess sucks to be me. Now, there's an enemy sitting in the northwest area of the map who I want to move and trigger Silvis's Overwatch so that Enid can have a crack at him, but he just doesn't really want to move. It takes me waiting with almost all of my other units over the course of this turn before he finally goes in and triggers that to happen. And this is important to feed to Enid because she is ready to get a level up. She's only hitting level 5 at this point, but from that kill she is able to get to 3 magic, which is an important benchmark because she needs to be at 3 magic before level 6 so that she can potentially get 4 magic starting from there. To be honest, that 20% growth has been really bugging me, and I really hope that I can figure out how to get a Soma so I can get the liquid magic, because I do not want to have to drag her up to level 11. Sherpa switches back to the longsword at this point because obviously I don't want him frivolously wasting Brim Ranger durability, because that weapon is starting to get a bit worn down. Now we are on turn 7, so 2 of the ballisticians have started moving and the third is about to follow suit, but you'll notice that also the Bishop Simus has emerged from the church that Ward was waiting on, and that means Ward is now free to start helping me out as well. Simus has a Physic Orb which he is going to use during this map, and that makes him more helpful at this point than any of the ballisticians, so I'm very glad that he is here and doing that for us. Back in the west, Dean is strong enough that he is killing some of these guys a bit too easily if they fail to activate their shields, which happened here. But that is okay. Dean is getting fairly close to the 60 kills needed for him to be permanently recruited, which I am very excited about, and so that's worth giving him some of the kills that should probably have gone for Enid. Ward is heading over to join the Eastern group, and that means that Ruby is now backed up by some of my strongest units, so she's going to have a fairly easy time over there. So now we are up to turn 8, and Burrows still has not moved from his starting position, but he is going to near the end of this turn, and that means that all of our ballisticians are finally going to be in motion. Based on how the map has gone so far, you might think that it is pretty much over and all I need to do is just hold some choke points, but near the end of the map, reinforcements do start to emerge down in the southwest, so it's definitely not over yet. I have Reese move over to give Enid 100 listed hit against this enemy. This is a small optimization, but it's pretty important because Enid really needs the kills, and I'm starting to feel the pressure to get her to sufficient magic by the end of this map. Spoilers, she does not. But in any case, speaking of the reinforcements that are upcoming, you will notice that I have been keeping very much on top of the enemies that have spawned. Other than that one guy, nobody has even come close to threatening any of the green units. This is because I can obviously focus all of my units into plugging those gaps, because I'm not even close to needing to retreat towards the escape point, even with my lower move units. Owen, of course, is not going to have to walk down there in the first place, but even my 4 move units have plenty of time to catch up to the 2 move ballisticians. In addition, most of the enemies that we've seen so far have been very weak. The stronger enemies are not going to show up for several more turns, and that means that I am more than capable of keeping the enemy numbers under control to this extent without too much difficulty. However, now that all of the ballisticians have started to move, that is going to begin to change, and that's first exemplified by a bunch of reinforcements with bows showing up all at once. As I've mentioned, I do not like having to fight bow enemies, and so this, I do believe, marks the turning point of this map. Fortunately, Ruby, as mentioned earlier, has the 3 strongest units on the map backing her up in taking the reinforcements out in that area, so she's going to have very little trouble over there. Of course, one could argue that Ward would be more effective if he would just hit all of his attacks for once, but this really just means that this enemy is left alive for Ruby to defeat, and this gets her up to level 11. Now, getting her to level 11 is overkill for my goals in this map, and on the one hand it's pretty good because it gives her more shots at raising her equipment experience levels. However, at level 11 she also loses access to the Paragon skill. This is a little unfortunate, because in order for her to promote, she does actually have to level up after being permanently recruited, and obviously she hasn't been permanently recruited yet. And that means that I'm going to have to get her at least 1 level up without the benefit of the extra 20% experience from Paragon. Ultimately, I am more than capable of getting that level, and she's going to need to see a lot of combat to raise her ranks anyway, but it's just a small annoyance there. Meryl has finally reached the escape point and left the map, and that means that one of our civilian requests is entirely complete and in the bag, ready to be milked once we get back out of this extremely long map. Now, once again, a couple of things are happening that are a general theme in this map. Firstly, I was once again having random units wait or waste their actions in order to get an enemy to move into Overwatch range, and then secondly, Dean kills another unit that was meant for Enid because that unit failed to activate their shield. But again, that's okay, because this map really isn't behaving like any old LTC map. It's more like a defend map, and that means that we have plenty of time to do all manner of frivolous things. So we have reached the turn 10 save point, finally, and yet the ballisticians are still leaving the central town area. They're not even close to the escape point yet. So we're still not even close to the end of this video. So, one of the reinforcements that shows up on this turn is a woman named Kay, and she is part of Sherpa's permanent recruitment event. Sherpa needs to talk to her, or she needs to talk to him. And obviously, because I want Sherpa's action on this turn, I'm going to have him take his action and let Kay talk to him. In terms of the plot, Kay is a figure from Sherpa's past. They're both from the Highlands, and she is here to exact some sort of revenge upon him. So once she talks to him, she takes him away from the map, and that leaves me down him for the rest of the map, but she is also going to leave the map at this point, and that's probably for the best because trying to fight her would have been kind of a pain. So we'll see Sherpa again later, but that's it for this map. As for the rest of my units, at this point, since all of the ballisticians have started to move and are a decent way down the road, finally, we are going to begin the Great Retreat, and to that end, several of my units are going to be mounting up. Plus there's some reorganization going on as to who is going to be where. As is kind of expected at this point, Dean is going to attempt to chip down an enemy, and instead, because the guy fails to activate his shield, he is going to get the kill, and that's kind of okay. Clifford has already started moving over to the west, and since Sherpa's also gone, that leaves Ruby with only Ward to support her at this point. So she is going to be jumping on her horse, ready to do a running retreat down to the south of the map. Now, as I complained earlier, there are quite a lot of bow enemies among these reinforcements, which means that Ruby is not going to be doing very much countering. However, because she is being attacked so much, she gets a ton of opportunities to get small shield rank. And in fact, I believe she gets 4 small shield rank over the course of 4 or 5 combats, so it's pretty darn quick. It's kind of hard to remember back in the day how I was so worried about getting Ruby's small shield all the way up from 0, given how far she has come, and soon enough she will hopefully be able to promote and finally turn into an actually good unit. Now, since Clifford has headed over to the west, Volo is going to turn around and start heading for the escape point, because he only has 4 move, and the fewer 4 move units I have to deal with later on, the better. However, he is going to end up getting diverted to support the eastern side, because again, all of the good units have kind of abandoned Ruby and Ward to fend for themselves over there, and just Ward is not going to be nearly enough to deal with that stuff. Enid does something kind of unexpected. She stands on a cliff here, and there is a method to this madness, because this means that in order to try to attack her, an enemy needs to go through Sylvis's Overwatch range, and that means that Enid is of course completely safe here. So, you know, master plan. Now let's take a moment to talk about proc skills. You see, MAME has been activating all over the place during this map, and it's about to go off again. But for some reason, somehow, absolutely none of these MAME procs have actually resulted in an enemy being crippled. Like, what? If you've activated the rare activation proc skill, surely you should get some kind of guaranteed result out of it? I don't know. I guess Kargam works in mysterious ways after all. Anyway, in my haste to arrange other units to do what they want, I've kind of mismanaged my movement order, and Owen is able to be targeted by an enemy, which leaves him in a somewhat precarious situation here. Fortunately, as you can expect from the video continuing, he's going to be able to get out of it alright, but really at this point I was starting to get exhausted with this map, and I wasn't playing my best, which, you know, isn't even all that good. Reese manages to pick off an enemy here. He is pretty low level, really. I haven't done much training of him at all. I guess I took the advice of don't bother training up your lords a bit too much to heart. Although part of it is also that this game's structure really doesn't benefit him all that much. Ruby gets hit, and that finally raises her small shield all the way up to 20. So she is done grinding out shield rank completely, and from now on I just need to focus on getting her sword and spear ranks up to par. But then again, deep down she's still the same old Ruby who misses everything that she attacks and is absolute dogshit. So Volo is forced to move in and tidy up her mistakes, which of course he does because Volo is actually a good unit and Ruby sucks. Now, you might have noticed that some pretty nasty enemies have started to be sprinkled through the soldiers that we've been fighting so far. And obviously, once they start dropping strong units on us, we need to deploy our own to deal with them. So Clifford goes up against one specific enemy who has counter, but that counter attack manages to miss Clifford, which means he gets another go, and the end result of this is that that enemy actually ends up getting crippled despite being a really strong enemy. And so he is going to end up being free experience for Enid in a moment. Dean has been picking up so many kills here that he actually manages to gain a level up, and I am actually wondering how close he is to promotion, because if this keeps up he might end up being promoted before I even manage to permanently recruit him. I think there's a chance that the 60 kill threshold was set deliberately to make this sort of thing happen often, so we'll see how that shakes out. Enid now takes the capture that Clifford set up for her, and this gets her to level 6, and she does not get magic, which is a bit frustrating. However, because of the unlikelihood of capturing that particular enemy, I decided to keep this take regardless, and continue forging on with training her to higher levels. This is worth it because it gives her more opportunities to get that 4th magic point that she needs, and it also means that she is going to be closer to level 11 if it turns out that I end up having to get her up there due to never actually picking up the liquid magic. Now, as I have gone over, we are starting to get some of these stronger reinforcements coming in, but what's going to happen later on that makes this map really hairy at the end is that cavalry enemies are eventually going to start spawning in. And I kind of have questions about this, because isn't cavalry normally what you want to send in first, because they have higher mobility and can take out the enemy more efficiently, rather than sending in your infantry and then bringing in the cavalry later? I don't know, I'm not really familiar with real life tactics, but it kind of feels like not sending in the cavalry first means you're going to let your enemies escape, if they want to. I guess it is a game after all. Anyway, Axel is now scrambling to the southwest because reinforcements have started spawning there, and he is capable of handling himself against them for at least a turn or two. So at this point the map has turned into just a very, very slow walk to the exit. So what I'm really focusing on is my side objectives, and one of those is Ruby. She still needs to grind out her sword and spear weapon experience, as I mentioned earlier, and so she's going to be switching between swords and spears a fair amount for the remainder of her combat in this map. Now, you'll notice that Owen is still badly damaged, and at this point I kind of really wanted to have another healer around, because then they would be able to heal Owen up, and Owen could then go closer to the front lines. But as it stands, it's far too dangerous for him to do that, and so he needs to be hiding down away from the enemies as much as possible here. There is a pretty nasty axe guard up in the western area of the map, and he is going to be ganged up on by several of my units, and one of those is of course going to be Dean, who's going to be getting the kill. He still is carrying around a war pick, which goes straight through enemy shields, and because a large part of the axe guard class's identity seems to be that they carry around really powerful shields. That's pretty nice to have, and that gets Dean yet another kill towards his recruitment target. Clifford, of course, is also putting in work chipping down these enemies, as is only natural because Clifford is amazing, unlike his worthless daughter. Anyway, we are now coming up to the turn 15 save point, which means that the end is finally in sight. Burrows is going to be able to escape once turn 19 rolls around, so that is when I need to have all of my units down there and ready to escape alongside him. This is the point of the map where I kind of noticed that he had hurry and was like, come on man, just use it, just once, save me that turn, please. But of course he can't hear me, so he never does. Anyway, the cavalry reinforcements that I alluded to earlier have started to show up, and they are going to be closing the distance between the edges of the map and our fighting units in a very quick time frame. So this is where the map starts to get a bit scarier for me, and I am definitely going to be focusing on keeping the cavalry units away from the southern parts of the map as much as possible. To that end, I am stalling a bit as I did earlier for the Overwatch, but this time I want to be waiting until some of the more threatening enemies make their moves and leave themselves in range of my powerful units so that I can try and scrub them off the map as quickly as possible without them ever becoming a threat to Burrows and the other ballistician. This obviously pays off as Dean is able to claim a kill on counter, and then an Axe Guard in the southeast moves up and has a go at Axel, who has also not yet moved. Axel is able to dodge and put in a significant hit against this Axe Guard, which is pretty great. Unfortunately, what's going to happen next is I'm going to try and feed that kill into someone else. So first up I bring in Silvus, who has a go, and unfortunately I use one of the weaker arrows, and the end result of that is that I deal a total of 2 damage because of an untimely shield activation. I mean, come on, why couldn't that shield activation have happened earlier against like Dean or someone, so I could have fed someone else into Enid? Anyway, Enid and Reese then both line up to have a crack at finishing the job, and both of them utterly fail, missing their attacks, and then getting whacked for significant damage by this Axe Guard, which is really kind of silly. In the end, only Axel himself is able to finish the job that he started by using his Pulverize, which not even the immense defense granted by a shield activation can completely ward off. So Axel is pretty great. For some reason there's a guy here who has a face, but even with a face he is absolutely no match for Ward, who puts him down pretty quickly. He's no big deal. So, one thing about the cavalry reinforcements that isn't a complete disaster for my strategy here is that they are not able to cross the cliffs, which means that I am able to use the small gaps between the cliffs as choke points in order to prevent at least them from getting close to my more vulnerable units. It's not going to stop the remaining infantry enemies, of course, but they are less of a threat due to lower movement, and I can pick them off one by one as they come anyway. One of the enemy cavalry units is actually kind of threatening due to having a swift bow, and he ends up breaking Ward's shield here. Luckily, Ward is carrying around a backup shield that he's going to equip in a moment, so all's well that ends well really, but we definitely want to keep that cavalry unit away from anyone who would be 2-hit KO'd by him. And of course Ruby continues to demonstrate how bad she is by utterly failing to do any damage to him. Annoyingly, relying on Jakins also isn't going to work out here, as Ward manages to miss one of his 2 hits, because he also has surprisingly low accuracy against this particular enemy. I'm not sure why, and it's a pain in the ass, but it means the Swiftbow guy is going to live for another day. At least until I can get some actually good unit along to deal with him, hopefully. The cavalry enemies are now really coming in earnest, and Clifford is going to go out and chip one down before retreating to the choke point. But at this point I kind of want to eliminate at least some of them because there's a lot, Do I choose to do it? Well, I choose Enid. This is kind of a silly risk that I took here, because Enid is on pretty low health, I think, and it's lucky that she managed to get a critical hit to avoid being countered. Now, she needs to be protected at this point, because even though she was successful there, she's still in danger. And so Reese is going to head out there to hold the choke point between the cliff and the building, and he's going to take Enid's vulnerary in order to heal up himself and make sure that he doesn't die from a stray hit. I believe I did actually get him killed at about this point in a previous attempt, so, you know, this was my attempt to make it a bit more reliable here. Now, at this point I am having to kind of balance between my infantry units retreating to the escape point, because they're now the ones with the pretty low movement, and having them defeat threatening enemies as they come at me, because obviously I don't want to be leaving threatening enemies alive, and I don't have enough cavalry to cover all of them at once. And it's also important for my infantry units to be picking up experience points, but really it's going to be a delicate balance there that I think I made work out, but we'll see later on in the run. Now, I tried to have Enid move back out of the way to prevent her being targeted by the swift bow guy, but instead he decided to retreat and use a vulnerary anyway. So that actually took the pressure off on a turn that I was starting to get a little worried that my recklessness was going to cost me on. So now let's take a look back over to the east a little bit, near the cliff. There is a brave crossbow enemy there, which is obviously scary because brave crossbows hit twice. So I'm going to have Volo move over there and chip him down a bit, which is the start of the story of this brave crossbow guy, which ends up being pretty darn hilarious. As you may be able to tell, I'm a bit strapped for things to talk about at this point, so I have to make my own amusement where I can. So, back to the brave crossbow guy. He's just sitting there, he's been whacked around by Volo, and then of course he sees a mounted enemy come up to him, Ruby, and she swings and utterly fails to do anything, so she gets beaten up a bit more, and that's not really ideal. So he lives to fight another day with his little crossbow. Anyway, it turns out that missing is catching, because Ward also manages to miss his target, and Ward's target is a bit more crucial because that's a mounted unit, and as I mentioned earlier, we want to prioritize killing them as much as possible. So someone is going to have to tidy up after Ward, whereas the brave crossbow guy is just going to be able to sit there until I have a unit nearby to finally finish him off. Reese is continuing to hold his choke point, but unfortunately despite proccing Adept, he is not able to one-round KO thanks to shield blocks. And now it's the brave crossbow guy's turn, and he steps right up to attack, and he breaks his brave crossbow, which makes him completely irrelevant from now on. He's effectively dead. So that removes one threat without me even having to kill him, and provides me with some much needed entertainment in this dreadfully long slog of a map. Now, we still have to tidy up after Ward's mistake, and Clifford of course is going to do that. Even though he only has 70 something hit, he is still able to land it and deal with that one enemy. So the situation is still that we are surrounded by cavalry, but we are successfully managing to hold the choke points, and all of our ballisticians are still safe and steadily approaching the escape point. What could possibly go wrong at this point? Well, as it turns out, it's time for the enemy's commander to finally make his appearance. This is Von Beck, and he appears up in the northwest of the map, all ready to march in and vanquish our army, and we are not going to engage him in combat one single time, because he is not mounted, he has no way of getting over to where we are, and I have no intention of going over there to challenge him. So really, he's completely irrelevant, and his cavalry underlings are far more threatening than he is, obviously. Ruby has another crack at the former brave crossbow guy here, but she somehow manages to miss again, and so he is going to be free to escape. Now, down in the southwest, I somehow forgot that the enemy is able to climb cliffs, so Sylvis ended up in a slightly precarious situation, getting attacked by one of the infantry enemies who I had previously completely dismissed from my attention. That's okay though, because Sylvis is pretty capable of taking hits, and she's in no real danger, but it's just more indication that I was starting to really get tired of this map by this point. And Zine has also gotten tired of this map, so she is ditching at this point. It was just going to get a bit too dangerous for someone that fragile to stick around, and her retreating at this point means that there's one extra space, theoretically, that I can have my units pile up and ready to escape once the ballisticians finally get close enough to do so. Now, it seems that Enid has forgotten which direction the escape point is in, as she moves over to the northwest bit again in order to take a kill. She is relatively safe here because only one more enemy is able to move and approach her, and that means she's in no danger of dying. But she is in a great deal of danger of not reaching the escape point in time from here. However, that's completely alright, because I have no particular reason to keep her on the map, and no particular use for all of the escape orb uses that I have available to me, and so Owen is going to walk right up to her and use the escape orb on her to get her off the map without having to go anywhere near the escape point. Owen, of course, is able to use his escape skill to exit the map at the very start of the next turn before any of the enemies have the opportunity to kill him, and so that deals with them getting off the map. They both picked up levels. Enid again failed to get magic despite hitting level 7, and Owen managed to get fire weapon rank, which is going to be extremely important going forward. Just kidding, in case you couldn't tell. At this stage, there are 2 relevant enemies left on the map, and Ward manages to kill one of them off right here. Owen escaping is going to open up room for the other one to move in and attack one of my units, but fortunately for me, the only one of my units who he can reach is Clifford, and Clifford is in absolutely no danger of being killed, because Clifford is godly. And Burrows finally escapes from the map, which means that we are now in cleanup mode. All I have to do is make sure that my units move off the map in an orderly fashion without leaving anyone exposed at the last moment. Ward obviously needs to sit between those forests until Ruby can get off, because I believe she still has some damage on her, and she could potentially be in danger if the enemy cavalry could catch up to her. I probably could have then sent Ward off once Ruby was safe, which would have saved some damage on his horse, but it's not all that much in the grand scheme of things, so it's not a big problem, and definitely not worth resetting over at this point in the map. So that's that. My strong units are making their retreats, and finally Reese is going to head off to complete the map in 19 turns. So after this map, there are a couple of cutscenes to go through that I skip over really quickly. These are related to Sherpa's recruitment, which is kind of unpleasant to contemplate, but it's alright. He ends up fine in the end, and he's going to join us in the next video. So see you then.